criteria that you just spoke of, that a lot of that comes directly through like social media, and so our access is there.
That's right.
And so a lot of times when we have, things that pop up, we automatically open them, usually without warning.
Yes.
And so we are exposed to traumatic events on a daily basis.
That's right. Camellia, Camellia, I can tell you, not to cut you off, I can tell you that I didn't know anything about George Floyd. It was I was watching the nightly news, and there it was. And I remember becoming physically ill. I became physically sick to my stomach. Not making that up. And I was just kind of riveted. And I wasn't expecting that. So go on. And I'm sorry I cut you off, but I just want people to know it's not like it happened. It can happen to everybody.
Yes.
So
and really that's what I was getting at with my point there is that it can happen with everyone, and just the frequency or the I guess the possibility of it happening is really just there. It's more present, just because we do have these devices that people can not only record but also they can share.
Yep.
Yeah. So I really with that it's speaking to just how prevalent our access is.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to go on with the criterion, and we can come back to that. Criterion B, and only one of these is required. The traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in the following ways: unwanted, upsetting memories, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional distress after exposure, and again, it's not rocket science to see the ways in which what we've been experiencing, can make these things, can make people meet the criteria. Criterion C, and only one is required: avoidance of trauma-related stimuli after the trauma in the following ways: trauma-related thoughts or feelings, or trauma-related reminders. So avoiding it. Criterion D, 2 are required: negative thoughts or feelings that began or worsened after the trauma in the following ways: inability to recall key features of the trauma, overly negative thoughts and assumptions about oneself or the world, exaggerated blame or of self or others for causing the trauma, negative affect, which is expression, decreased interest in activities, feeling isolated, difficulty experiencing positive affect. And again, okay, so we'll go through all of these. It's the last criterion is criterion E, and then we can come back to them. Criterion E, 2 are required: trauma-related arousal and reactivity that began or worsened after the trauma in the following ways: irritability or aggression, risky or destructive behavior, hypervigilance, heightened startle reaction, difficulty concentrating, or difficulty sleeping. So those are the criteria for PTSD. And when you look at them, to your point that, we have it's so easy to be exposed. The re-witnessing, and I'm sure you've given your patients the same advice. I've really asked patients and people in general who ask me, and tell me how they're feeling about all of this, to not steep in watching and rewatching.
Yes.
We as a nation, the world watched someone killed on television. It's not like a regular event
Right.
in terms of how each of us see it. Unfortunately, it's a too regular event, in this country. But we watched it, and those memories are there. The images are there. And so the steeping, the watching it again and again, the sharing it you brought up on social media, just our brains are just not set up to be to have those kinds of experiences and not experience it as trauma, as a traumatic event. And then we go to the protests. And fear of COVID and the group of people protesting, and then we got to rubber bullets and tear gas and standoffs with the police, and all of these things are traumatizing for people who were present. They're also traumatizing for us watching, right?
Yes.
And then could you speak some about the trauma of the pandemic?
Absolutely. I think, with us having, it come on with no warning, without warning, I think is one thing. And then trying to, navigate how we respond to it, I think is another thing. I will say, just with, again, it goes back to the sharing of, information and the sharing on social media and, watching the television. We see statistics, we see numbers, we see, death rates being shared. We also see, images of full hospitals or hospitals functioning at maximum capacity. All of those images. We see the nurses and the medical professionals garbed, without being able to see their faces. And, I think all of these things are playing on, what we remember and what we will remember in terms of, just what hasn't been normal, what we haven't been exposed to. But now that we are, it doesn't look like what we've seen, and it can be traumatic in that way.
Sure.
Because it is, just that. It is impacting, what we do every day. It's impacting for many people our ability to function without restraint.
Sure.
I think, those are the things that we when we talk about exposure and now, with having numbers kind of being, very specific around, how many people are dying and how many people, what your rate is of possibly, transmitting, this, all of these things play a part.
Yeah. And Camellia, I mean, so I worked at the VA for several years and still miss my vets. And in the clinic that I was working in, 80% of the patient population had PTSD. And so it was, it was difficult but very rewarding work. And, direct exposure, witnessing of a trauma, feeling, and usually the trauma makes the person feel that they could be killed, that's threatened death or injury. And, that everyone sort of understands that in a combat context. It's maybe a little bit more difficult for people to extrapolate to COVID-19 and think of it as in that context. Think of PTSD in that context. But the reality is, many people, I am one, know at least are not 7 degrees of separation away from someone who has died from COVID-19 or someone in their family who has been infected, and so they have had profound fear around the loss of that person, even if the person makes it through. I have someone in my in-law family who was very, very sick with COVID-19 and got over it over a month ago, but still it's not quite back to themselves. And so there's this very direct exposure to something that, we're washing hands and hand sanitizing and wearing masks, and I've got to get this in. Please, 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 listeners, no matter what you're hearing, you must mask. I know it's not cute. That's not the point. You must mask. And so we're literally walking down the street or walking into a store, masked and afraid of the threat of something that could kill us or that we could give to someone else and could kill them. And so technically every day in every way, we are being re-exposed. Even if we're not watching it, we are living a traumatic event. And I have said this before, that COVID-19 is an international trauma. And
Absolutely.
it is. We have people who are, on food bank lines hoping that they can get enough food to their children that day. This is traumatizing in so many ways. And I'm listening all the time to people afraid about whether or not they're going to be keeping their jobs, people who are on unemployment and hoping that they will be able to keep unemployment because they have lost their jobs, people who don't know how they're going to get a new job because in their field people are not hiring during COVID-19. We don't know the extent of it. Every day you don't really know. You could be, yes. you could get sick, you could not get sick, you could be a carrier and be asymptomatic. We're really, I just have to stress this because I feel like in order to go on, and I think that's what allows people to go without their masks, or to not social distance at the beach, that in order to go on, we kind of try to, that's part of what our mind lets us do, which is great because we can't stay in the trauma every minute. But yes. we are even if you're staying home, you're staying home because, so there's something out there kind of thing. So I just really want to stress this because those of you who are kind of not feeling like yourselves and saying this feels so strange, just know that it is normal at this point for us to feel something. We're human beings. We're not deer, we're not plants, and who knows if they're experiencing it as well. But we certainly know that we're human beings, and so we are supposed to be having some effect from 4 or 5. Where are we? We're coming to 6 months of yes. a pandemic, and then in the midst of that, watching George Floyd killed, and watching the protests thereafter. And noting the political climate that we're in and the racial climate that we're in this country. It's a lot. Yeah. And I just really wanted, we're mental health professionals and we are trained in every day, look at the nuance between what one should worry about and what one should not worry about in terms of their mental health. But I just really wanted to stress, it's not to say don't worry, but it's to say if you don't have any reaction, that would be a little weird, wouldn't it? That would be weird to not have any reaction. Like, yes. What's going on? This is because nothing that's happening right now is regular, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think one other important point that you made when you referenced, working at the VA and having just a high population of patients with PTSD. Mm-hmm. A lot of times what we think about, and a lot of my role as a nurse practitioner is also education. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times what we think about with PTSD is the military. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I also want to just kind of hone in on the point that it can exist outside of military personnel. And
it does.
Hence our reason for having this conversation today. Mm-hmm. But I think, it's important to kind of remember that when we think about PTSD, because we've been exposed or witnessed or been re-exposed to traumatic events, it can also apply to anyone.
Of course. And
mm-hmm.
and most traumatic situations. So there are people I'm noting a number of patients who had trauma in their childhood, mm-hmm. kind of came out of it, had rough years, came out of it, became, had got jobs, had children, marriage, and now these present events have sort of been like a recapitulation of their PTSD. Like it's just not... it's been a bit too stressful for the person that already had experienced years of PTSD. So there's all kinds of nuance to the thing, and I'd say to you listeners out there, we're not implying that you're supposed to know whether or not you have PTSD, but we are saying if you're really, really suffering,